The dusty archive room of the West Virginia Historical Society smelled of aged paper and forgotten time, a scent that Dr. Sarah Mitchell had come to associate with discovery and revelation over her 2 decades as a historian. She sat at one of the long wooden tables near the tall windows, carefully turning the pages of a leather-bound ledger containing photographs from rural schools across the region. It was a cold February morning in Charleston, and the gray light filtering through the frost-edged glass cast long shadows across the research room where she worked in near solitude. The radiators clanked and hissed periodically, struggling to maintain warmth against the bitter wind that swept down from the mountains surrounding the capital city. Sarah had spent the better part of 3 years researching the development of education in coal mining communities, documenting how children of immigrant workers and local families came together in one-room schoolhouses scattered throughout the Appalachian Mountains. Her work was meticulous and deeply personal, driven by a connection to the region where her own great-grandmother had taught in similar circumstances during the 1920s and 30s. She had inherited boxes of her great-grandmother's teaching materials, lesson plans, and correspondence that painted a vivid picture of education in isolated mountain communities. Those family documents had inspired Sarah to pursue her academic career and to focus specifically on how education had functioned in communities built around resource extraction industries. The photograph appeared unremarkable at first glance, just another image in a collection of hundreds documenting rural education in West Virginia during the early 20th century. Dated September 1903, it showed a typical one-room schoolhouse interior in McDowell County, specifically in the small mining community of Bramwell, which had been one of the region's most productive coal areas during that period. 23 children stood in 3 neat rows, their faces serious and composed as was customary for photographs of that era when subjects had to remain perfectly still for the extended exposure times required by early camera technology. The children ranged in age from approximately 6 to 15 years old, their clothing a mixture of homemade garments and hand-me-downs that reflected the economic circumstances of mining families. The teacher, a young woman named Miss Elizabeth Hartwell according to the notation on the photograph's backing, stood at the left side of the frame, her hand resting on a desk in a pose that suggested both authority and care. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, wearing a high-collared white blouse and a long dark skirt that was typical professional attire for female teachers of the period. Her expression was serious but not stern, her eyes looking directly at the camera with an intensity that seemed to transcend the formal constraints of portrait photography. What caught Sarah's attention initially was not the students themselves or their teacher but rather the blackboard visible behind them in the upper portion of the photograph. Unlike most school photographs where blackboards were either erased clean to avoid distraction or displayed arithmetic problems, spelling words, or motivational phrases, this one contained a carefully written list of names in elegant cursive script. The penmanship was exceptionally clear and deliberate, suggesting that the writing had been done specifically for the photograph rather than as part of regular classroom instruction. Sarah leaned closer with her magnifying glass, squinting to make out the chalked letters that had been captured by the camera's lens over a century ago. The quality of the photograph was remarkably good for its age, suggesting that the original glass plate negative had been well preserved and that the print she was examining had been made with care. The names were clearly legible despite the photograph's age and the inherent limitations of early photographic technology. Thomas Kowalski, age 12. Margaret O'Brien, age 9. James Dawson, age 14. Giuseppe Martinelli, age 11. The list continued down the board in 2 neat columns, 19 names in total, each followed by an age that ranged from 6 to 15 years old. Sarah felt a peculiar unease settling in her chest as she studied the list. Something about the formal presentation of these names, the way they were written with such deliberate care and precision, struck her as unusual for an ordinary classroom photograph. The spacing was even, the letters perfectly formed, and the ages included as if recording something significant rather than simply listing students for a roll call exercise. She carefully noted each name in her research journal, her handwriting becoming increasingly hurried as a theory began forming in her mind. Her historian's instinct, honed through years of archival research and pattern recognition, was telling her that something was not quite right about this image. These names were not presented as a class roster or attendance record. They were written as if in memorial, as if recording something that needed to be remembered and preserved. The formality of the presentation, the inclusion of ages, and the positioning of the blackboard prominently in the photograph all suggested intentionality and purpose beyond typical classroom documentation. Sarah spent the next several hours photographing the image from multiple angles, capturing every detail with her high-resolution camera. She made notes about the photograph's physical condition, its archival location, and any contextual information provided by the Historical Society's cataloging system. The photograph had been donated to the Society in 1967 by a descendant of a Bramwell family, part of a larger collection of materials related to coal mining communities in southern West Virginia. It had been processed and stored but had never been the subject of detailed research or analysis. The cataloging information noted only the date, location, and the teacher's name, with no explanation of the significance of the blackboard names visible in the image. As the afternoon wore on and the winter light began to fade, Sarah gathered her materials and moved to the computer terminal in the research room's corner. The Historical Society had been working for several years to digitize county records, census data, vital statistics, and newspaper archives, making it possible to conduct research that would have required weeks or months of travel and manual searching just a generation earlier. Sarah began cross-referencing the names against the Historical Society's digital archives, searching through census records, birth certificates, death registries, and newspaper databases for McDowell County during the early 1900s. The coal mining region had been a remarkable melting pot of nationalities during that period, with Polish, Italian, Irish, Hungarian, African American, and local Appalachian families all seeking work in the booming mining industry that had transformed the mountains into one of America's most productive coal-producing regions. The diversity was clearly reflected in the surnames on the blackboard, representing the ethnic composition of the mining camps where families from across the world had converged in search of economic opportunity. The mines had recruited workers aggressively, sending agents to Eastern European countries, to Italy, to Ireland, and to the American South to attract laborers willing to work in dangerous conditions for wages that, while low by national standards, exceeded what many could earn in their places of origin. As Sarah worked through the afternoon and into the early evening, the winter's sun tracking across the room and finally dipping below the mountains visible through the windows, a disturbing pattern began to emerge from the records she was uncovering. The research room had emptied of other scholars, leaving Sarah alone with the hum of the computer and the occasional creak of the building settling in the cold. She barely noticed the passage of time, her attention completely focused on the information appearing on her screen as she searched through database after database, following leads and cross-referencing documents with increasing urgency. Thomas Kowalski, the first name on the list, had died on March 15, 1902, in a mining accident at the Red Ash Mine located approximately 3 miles from Bramwell. The mine had been one of the region's most productive operations, employing over 400 men and boys at its peak. According to the coroner's report and newspaper accounts, Thomas had been killed along with his father Joseph and 8 other miners when a support timber failed in a newly excavated shaft, bringing down tons of rock and coal onto the workers below. Thomas had been employed as a trapper boy, one of the youngest and most vulnerable positions in the mine, responsible for opening and closing heavy wooden ventilation doors as coal cars passed through the tunnels. His job required him to sit alone in the darkness for 10 to 12 hours a day, waiting to hear the approach of coal cars so he could open the doors and allow them to pass before closing them again to maintain the airflow necessary to prevent gas accumulation. The newspaper report from the Bluefield Daily Telegraph described the accident in graphic detail, noting that rescue efforts had continued for 3 days before all the bodies were recovered. Thomas had been at his post near the site of the collapse when it occurred, and his small body had been found partially buried under debris, his lunch pail still beside him containing the bread and cheese his mother had packed that morning. His death had left his mother Anna widowed and solely responsible for 3 younger siblings, aged 8, 6, and 4. The family had remained in Bramwell, dependent on company charity and whatever work Anna could obtain, taking in laundry and doing domestic work for the families of mine supervisors and operators. Margaret O'Brien had succumbed to scarlet fever on June 2, 1901, during an outbreak that swept through the mining camps with devastating effect. Scarlet fever, a bacterial infection that had been one of the leading causes of childhood mortality in the early 20th century, spread rapidly in the crowded and unsanitary conditions that characterized coal camp housing. Families typically lived in small wooden structures with minimal ventilation, shared water sources, and inadequate waste disposal systems. The company doctor, employed by the mine operators to provide minimal medical care to workers and their families, had been overwhelmed by the number of cases during the outbreak. Many families had lacked the resources to pay even the modest fees charged for medical visits and had relied instead on traditional remedies and home nursing care that proved inadequate against the serious bacterial infection. Margaret had developed the characteristic bright red rash and high fever that gave the disease its name. Her mother had tried desperately to bring down her temperature with cool compresses made from well water, had given her willow bark tea for the fever, and had kept her isolated from her siblings in a vain attempt to prevent further spread. Despite these efforts, the infection had progressed to her kidneys and heart, causing organ failure. She had died at home in the small wooden house her family rented from the coal company, with her mother Catherine holding her and praying as the child's breathing became increasingly labored and finally stopped. Her younger brother Patrick had shown symptoms 2 days after her death, and despite his mother's frantic attempts to save him using the same methods that had failed to help Margaret, he had followed his sister to the grave before the week ended. The O'Brien family plot in the hillside cemetery contained markers for both children, small headstones that Catherine had somehow found the money to purchase, perhaps by selling possessions or accepting charity from neighbors who understood her grief. James Dawson had drowned in the Bluestone River on August 20, 1900, during what should have been a moment of childhood joy and freedom from the constant labor that characterized his daily life. He and several other boys from the mining camp had gone to the river to fish on a Sunday afternoon, taking advantage of one of their rare days without work obligations. Sunday was typically the only day when child workers were not required to report to the mines, and boys would often spend these precious hours of freedom fishing, swimming, or exploring the mountains. A thunderstorm had rolled through the region that morning, and the river was running higher and faster than usual, its waters swollen and turbulent from the mountain runoff. James had been attempting to cross to what the boys considered a better fishing spot on the opposite bank, a crossing they had made dozens of times during lower water conditions. The current had been deceptive, appearing manageable near the bank but concealing dangerous undertows and increased velocity in the deeper channel. James had been approximately halfway across when the current caught him, pulling him off his feet and sweeping him downstream despite his efforts to regain his footing or swim to safety. His friends had run along the bank trying to reach him, shouting instructions and throwing branches, but the river had been too strong and too fast. They had watched helplessly as James was carried around a bend and out of sight, his arms still thrashing as he tried to keep his head above the churning brown water. His body had been recovered 2 miles downstream the following day, caught against a fallen tree that had created a partial dam across a narrow section of the river. The recovery had been witnessed by many people from the mining camps, as word of the drowning had spread quickly through the community. James had been an only child, and his parents Robert and had been utterly devastated by the loss. Unable to bear remaining in the place where their son had died, where every familiar location reminded them of his presence and absence, they had left Bramwell within a month of his funeral. The last record Sarah could find showed them settling in Ohio, where Robert had found work in a factory rather than returning to mining. Giuseppe Martinelli had died from complications of pneumonia on November 4, 1902, after working in the cold and damp conditions of the mine's breaker room where young boys separated coal from slate and rock. The breaker room had been one of the most hazardous and unhealthy work environments in the mining operation, a massive wooden structure built above the mine entrance where coal was processed before being loaded onto railroad cars for shipment. Inside the breaker, coal tumbled down chutes and across moving screens while boys as young as 6 sat on wooden benches above the conveyor systems, picking out pieces of slate, rock, and other impurities with their bare hands. The work had been cold even in summer, as the breaker's ventilation system drew air from deep within the mine, but in winter it became almost unbearable. Boys worked without adequate gloves because gloves reduced their dexterity and made it harder to grasp the sharp pieces of coal and slate. Their hands would become cut, bruised, and calloused within weeks of starting work. The coal dust that filled the air in the breaker was so thick that boys working there would emerge after their shifts looking like living statues, their faces, hair, and clothes completely blackened. They breathed this dust for 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and respiratory problems were nearly universal among breaker boys. Giuseppe had developed a persistent cough in early October 1902, a deep, rattling sound that his mother Maria had recognized with dread as potentially serious. But his family could not afford for him to miss work. His father Domenico worked in the mine itself, and together their wages barely covered the family's rent at the company housing and their purchases at the company store, which charged inflated prices for food and supplies. The Martinelli family included 5 children, with Giuseppe being the oldest at 11 and therefore the first able to contribute to the family's income. Missing even a few days of work could mean the difference between having enough to eat and going hungry. Giuseppe had continued reporting to the breaker room each morning despite his worsening symptoms. By late October, he had been running a fever and struggling to breathe, his lungs filled with fluid and inflammation. His breaths had become wet and labored, and he had begun to cough up blood. The company doctor had finally been called when Giuseppe had collapsed at his workstation, unable to continue working. The doctor's examination had revealed advanced pneumonia, likely compounded by chronic lung damage from coal dust inhalation. There had been no antibiotics available, and treatment had consisted only of rest, fluids, and prayers. Giuseppe had been carried home to the small wooden house where the Martinelli family lived, and he had died there 2 days later, surrounded by his parents and siblings, many of whom would eventually suffer their own respiratory problems from similar work conditions. With each name Sarah researched, the same grim reality presented itself. Every single child listed on that blackboard had died before September 1903 when the photograph was taken. None of them could have been standing in that classroom. None of them would ever again sit at a desk, recite lessons, or play during recess. Yet there they were, 19 names carefully inscribed on the blackboard behind their surviving classmates, preserved in silver halide emulsion on a glass plate negative that had captured this moment of remembrance and made it permanent. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she printed out the death certificates, coroner's reports, and burial records for each child. The youngest on the list had been only 6 years old, the oldest 15. The causes of death painted a brutal picture of life in Appalachian coal country at the turn of the 20th century. Mining accidents, industrial injuries, infectious diseases, drowning, falls, and 1 case of blood poisoning from an untreated cut sustained while working in the mine's mechanical shop. As darkness fell completely outside and the archive's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their harsh artificial glow across Sarah's research materials, she sat back in her chair and stared at the photograph she had pinned to her portable research board. The children in the image looked back at her with their solemn expressions, their faces frozen in time, their lives continuing beyond this moment only in memory and in whatever descendants they might have had if they had lived to adulthood. But these were the survivors, she realized with a sudden clarity that made her breath catch. These were the children who had lived to see September 1903, who had stood for this portrait at the beginning of another school year, who had known and remembered the 19 children whose names were written on the blackboard behind them, and behind them, written in Miss Elizabeth Hartwell's careful, deliberate hand, were the names of their classmates, neighbors, friends, and in some cases siblings who would never return to that classroom. The blackboard was not a student roster or an attendance record or a random list. It was a memorial, carefully planned and deliberately included in the photograph. It was a teacher's way of ensuring that the dead children of Bramwell would not be forgotten, that their names would be recorded and remembered, captured in a photograph that would outlast the temporary chalk, the wooden schoolhouse itself, and perhaps even the memory of those who had known them in life. Sarah made copies of all the relevant documents and secured permission from the Historical Society to take the photograph for further study and analysis. She left the building that evening with a heavy canvas bag full of research materials, printouts, and digital files, and with a growing sense that this photograph represented something profoundly important about the often overlooked human cost of America's industrial expansion. The children whose names adorned that blackboard had been sacrificed to coal and poverty and the dangerous realities of mountain life in an era before labor laws, workplace safety regulations, or adequate health care. Their deaths had barely been recorded in official histories, reduced to brief statistical entries in county records or short paragraphs in local newspapers before being forgotten. But Miss Elizabeth Hartwell had ensured they would be remembered in at least one permanent way, in one image that would survive long after everyone who had known these children had themselves passed away. The following morning, Sarah arrived at her office at Marshall University in Huntington before sunrise, driven by an urgency she had not felt about her research in years. The photograph sat on her desk, reproduced in high resolution on her computer screen where she had uploaded the digital files, every detail magnified and clarified through modern imaging software that allowed her to zoom in on individual faces, to examine the texture of the blackboard, to read the faintest traces of chalk that the camera had captured. She had barely slept, her mind racing with questions about Miss Elizabeth Hartwell, about the circumstances surrounding the photograph, about what had motivated this particular act of memorialization. She had already contacted several colleagues in the fields of Appalachian history, industrial archaeology, labor studies, and childhood mortality, seeking any information they might have about Bramwell, McDowell County, and the specific circumstances of child mortality in coal mining communities. During the early 1900s, the responses had begun arriving overnight, filling her inbox with references, suggestions, leads to follow, and expressions of intense interest in her discovery. Several colleagues had immediately recognized the significance of the photograph, noting that while individual records of child deaths in mining communities existed, this kind of visual memorial was unprecedented in the historical record they knew. Bramwell itself had been one of the wealthiest towns in West Virginia during the early 20th century, a distinction that seemed paradoxical and even obscene given the poverty and suffering that characterized most mining communities in the region. The town had served as the commercial and social center for several highly productive coal operations in the surrounding mountains, and the coal operators, mine superintendents, and other executives who managed these operations had chosen to live in Bramwell rather than in the camps themselves. At its peak around 1910, Bramwell had boasted more millionaire residents per capita than any other town in America, their fortunes built directly on the black coal extracted from the earth by thousands of miners and their children who lived in very different circumstances. The mine owners and operators had constructed elegant Victorian homes along the tree-lined banks of the Bluestone River, elaborate residences with multiple stories, wraparound porches, stained glass windows, and the latest conveniences including electricity, indoor plumbing, and central heating. These homes still stood over a century later as museums and bed and breakfast establishments, carefully preserved monuments to that era of extraction and wealth accumulation. Tourists came to admire the architecture and to imagine the lifestyle of the coal barons who had lived in such luxury. But Sarah's research was leading her away from the mansions and their carefully maintained gardens, away from the main street with its historic commercial buildings, and into the hollows and mountainsides where the mining families had actually lived in company-owned housing. The coal camps had been entirely self-contained communities where miners rented their homes from the company that employed them, bought their supplies from company stores that often charged inflated prices due to lack of competition, and sent their children to company schools when those children were not needed for labor in the mines or for household work. The economic system had been designed, whether intentionally or through market dynamics, to keep families perpetually indebted to the company, unable to save enough money to leave or improve their circumstances. Workers were typically paid in scrip, company-issued currency that could only be spent at company stores, rather than in regular money that could be used elsewhere. This system ensured that wages paid to workers immediately returned to the company through purchases at the company store, where prices could be set without regard to normal market competition. Children had been particularly vulnerable in this arrangement, often pressed into work as soon as they were physically able to perform even the simplest tasks, their education interrupted or abandoned entirely so they could contribute to family survival. The work available to children ranged from relatively light tasks like tending the family's garden or carrying water to extremely dangerous industrial work in the mines themselves. Boys as young as 8 or 9 worked as trappers, door tenders, mule drivers, and eventually as miners. Girls typically worked in domestic settings, either helping their own families or hired out to work in the homes of supervisors and operators, though some also worked in the surface operations of mines doing sorting and cleaning work. Sarah scheduled a research trip to McDowell County for the following week, planning to visit the site where the Bramwell schoolhouse had stood, to search for any surviving records or artifacts related to the school, and to interview elderly residents who might have family memories or oral histories related to Miss Elizabeth Hartwell and her students. She spent the intervening days compiling increasingly detailed biographical information about each child whose name appeared on the blackboard, determined to reconstruct as much of their lives as possible from the fragmentary historical record. The process was emotionally exhausting, requiring her to read through coroner's reports that described injuries in clinical detail, witness testimonies that captured the trauma and chaos of accidents, and newspaper accounts that sometimes sensationalized deaths while other times dismissed them as routine industrial casualties. The deaths had occurred over a span of approximately 3 years, from 1900 to 1903, suggesting that Miss Hartwell had been teaching in Bramwell throughout that period and had witnessed the gradual accumulation of loss within her student body. Sarah calculated that Miss Hartwell had lost an average of more than 6 students per year during this period, a mortality rate that would have been unthinkable in more prosperous communities but that appeared to have been accepted as normal in the coal camps. Beyond Thomas, Margaret, James, and Giuseppe, whose stories Sarah had already researched in detail, the blackboard contained 15 other names, each representing another life cut short and another family destroyed by grief. Anna Kowalczyk, age 7, had died from diphtheria in January 1901. Diphtheria had been another major killer of children before the development of effective vaccines, causing a thick membrane to form in the throat that could block airways and lead to suffocation. Anna had been Thomas Kowalski's younger sister, making the Kowalski family's tragedy even more devastating. They had lost 2 children in addition to the father, leaving only 2 surviving siblings and their widowed mother. Patrick Sullivan, age 10, had been killed in a slate fall in the mine in April 1902. Slate falls were common accidents in coal mines, occurring when layers of rock above the coal seam became unstable and collapsed without warning. Patrick had been working as a helper to his father, learning the dangerous work of mining, when a section of the roof had given way. His father had pushed him towards safety but had not been able to get him completely clear before several tons of slate had crashed down. Patrick had survived long enough to be carried out of the mine but had died from his injuries before reaching the surface. John Novak, age 8, had died from injuries sustained when he was run over by a coal car in July 1901. The coal cars used in mines were small but extremely heavy wagons that ran on narrow tracks, pulled initially by mules or small ponies and later by mechanical systems. Boys working in the mines had to be constantly alert to avoid being struck by these cars in the narrow, dark tunnels. John had apparently been crossing a track to reach his workstation when a car had come around a curve faster than expected. The impact had crushed his legs and pelvis, and he had bled to death despite efforts to stop the hemorrhaging. Sarah documented each story with the same thoroughness, compiling photographs of death certificates, news clippings, burial records, and any other primary sources she could locate in archives, libraries, and online databases. She created a detailed timeline showing the sequence of deaths and began to understand more fully the cumulative weight of loss that Miss Hartwell must have experienced over those 3 years. Each death had left an empty desk in the classroom, a space where a living child had once sat, a voice that was no longer heard during lessons, a presence that was missed during recess and lunch periods. The teacher would have witnessed her students gradually disappearing, claimed one by one or sometimes in groups by the dangerous realities of industrial life in the mountains. The decision to memorialize these children on the blackboard behind her remaining students in the September 1903 photograph had been an act of defiance against the forgetting that typically claimed such lives, an insistence that these children had existed and mattered despite their poverty, their vulnerability, and their lack of social power. In an era when working-class children, and especially the children of immigrants, were often treated as disposable, as replaceable sources of labor whose deaths warranted little official attention, Miss Hartwell had created a permanent record of their existence. She had ensured that their names would be preserved not just in the fading memories of their families and friends but in a photograph that could circulate and be copied and reproduced indefinitely, Sarah also began researching Miss Elizabeth Hartwell herself more thoroughly, seeking to understand the young teacher who had made this remarkable choice. Elizabeth had been born in 1878 in Wheeling, West Virginia, to a middle-class family. Her father had been a clerk in a shipping company, and her mother had been a homemaker who had emphasized education for her children despite the limited opportunities available to women at that time. Elizabeth had attended normal school, a type of institution specifically dedicated to training teachers, and had received her teaching certificate in 1898 at age 20. Her first teaching position had been in Bramwell, suggesting that she had been willing to accept a challenging assignment in a remote coal mining community rather than seeking a more comfortable position in an urban school system. Records from the Bramwell School Board, archived at the McDowell County Courthouse, showed that Elizabeth had been hired in September 1899 at an annual salary of $240, paid monthly in scrip that she could exchange for cash at a discount or use at local stores. Her contract had required her to teach all grades from 1st through 8th in a single classroom, to maintain the schoolhouse building, to enforce discipline, and to follow a curriculum approved by the county school superintendent. The contract had also included morality clauses typical of the era, prohibiting her from marrying during the school year, from keeping company with men in public, from smoking or drinking alcohol, and from wearing clothing or behaving in ways deemed inappropriate for a female teacher. The school where Elizabeth taught had been built by the coal company that operated the Red Ash Mine and several smaller operations in the area. The company had been required by state law to provide educational facilities for children in the communities where it operated, but the quality and commitment to these schools had varied widely. Some companies had built substantial schoolhouses and hired qualified teachers, while others had provided only the bare minimum required to avoid legal penalties. The Bramwell School appeared to have been somewhere in the middle, a simple wooden structure with basic furniture and supplies but with a committed teacher who took her responsibilities seriously. Sarah found evidence of Elizabeth's dedication in school board minutes that recorded her requests for additional books, better heating for the building during winter months, and supplies for students whose families could not afford to purchase them. She had apparently used part of her own limited salary to buy chalk, paper, and books for her classroom, and she had advocated persistently for improvements to the school building and for better attendance policies that would allow children to spend more time in education rather than in work. The board minutes suggested that while Elizabeth had won some of these battles, she had lost others to the economic priorities of the coal company and the practical realities of families who depended on their children's wages for survival. The drive to McDowell County took Sarah through mountain landscapes that remained largely unchanged since 1903, though the coal industry that had once dominated the region had mostly collapsed, leaving behind abandoned mine sites, deteriorating company towns, and an economy struggling to find new foundations after decades of dependence on a single extractive industry. Sarah followed Route 52 south from Charleston through increasingly rugged terrain, watching as the mountains became steeper and more densely forested, their slopes still bearing the scars of old strip mining operations and the occasional abandoned tipple that marked the location of a former underground mine. It was early March, and the trees were still bare, their dark branches creating intricate patterns against the gray sky that threatened more snow. Occasional flurries drifted across the windshield, remnants of a winter storm that had moved through the region the previous night, leaving the higher elevations white and the roads requiring careful navigation. Sarah had grown up in West Virginia and was accustomed to mountain driving, but she still felt the isolation of these roads, the sense of being far from urban centers and modern conveniences, the understanding of why communities in these mountains had developed their own distinctive cultures and had sometimes seemed disconnected from broader American society. The landscape bore visible evidence of both the coal industry's heyday and its decline. She passed abandoned company towns where rows of identical wooden houses stood in various states of decay, their windows broken, their roofs collapsing, their yards overgrown with the forest reclaiming land that had been cleared for human habitation. She saw the rusted machinery of old mine sites, the concrete foundations of buildings that had been torn down or had fallen apart, the subsidence ponds where acid mine drainage collected in pools of orange water that nothing could grow in or drink from. But she also saw signs of resilience and adaptation, small communities that had survived the industry's collapse, newer businesses attempting to build tourism or light manufacturing economies, and the enduring beauty of mountains that would long outlast human attempts to extract their resources, Bramwell itself was a small town that seemed frozen in the early 20th century. Its Victorian architecture remarkably well preserved despite decades of economic decline and population loss. The millionaire mansions that had once housed coal operators still lined the main street along the Bluestone River, now converted into historical attractions, tourist accommodations, and museums that told carefully curated stories about the town's prosperous past. The contrast between these elaborate homes and the modest structures in other parts of town remained striking even after more than a century. Sarah parked near one of the historic homes and walked through the downtown area, noting the careful preservation efforts that had been made and wondering what stories were being emphasized and which were being overlooked in the town's public history presentations. But Sarah was not interested primarily in the homes of the wealthy or the sanitized narratives of prosperity and entrepreneurship. She drove through the town center and up into the surrounding hills where the mining camps had been located, following directions provided by the McDowell County Historical Society and using historical maps that showed the locations of former coal operations and their associated communities. The roads became narrower and less maintained as she climbed, in some places degrading to gravel or packed dirt that her vehicle handled with difficulty. She passed abandoned structures and overgrown foundations that marked the sites of former coal camps, places where hundreds or thousands of people had once lived but that had been completely abandoned when the mines closed and the companies moved on to new deposits elsewhere. The location where the one-room schoolhouse had stood was now an empty clearing in the woods, marked only by a depression in the ground where the foundation had been and a few scattered stones that had once supported the building's corners and supported its floor joists. Sarah parked her car along the narrow road and walked into the clearing, her boots crunching through the thin layer of snow that covered the ground. She tried to imagine the structure as it had appeared in the photograph, a simple wooden building perhaps 30 feet by 20 feet, with large windows along both long walls to admit natural light since electric lighting would not have been available, a small covered porch at the entrance where children could remove muddy boots before entering, a coal stove for heat during the mountain winters that could last from October through April. The schoolhouse had served multiple coal camps in the immediate area, with children walking up to 3 miles each way to attend classes when they were not required for work in the mines or at home. Sarah had read accounts describing how children would walk to school in darkness during the winter months, arriving after the sun had risen and leaving before it set, their paths lit only by lanterns or moonlight. Some children had attended school irregularly, coming when they could be spared from work rather than daily. The school year itself had been shorter than in urban areas, typically running from late September through early April with breaks during harvest seasons and during periods when the mines had extra work that required all available labor including children. Sarah walked the perimeter of the clearing, taking photographs and making notes about the site's current condition and its relationship to the surrounding landscape. She could see the mountains rising on all sides, understanding how isolated this community had been, how difficult it would have been to get to a doctor or hospital in case of emergency, how completely the families living here had been dependent on the coal company for employment, housing, and basic services. The nearest town of any size had been several hours away by the rough roads of the early 20th century, making the coal camps functionally independent communities despite their economic dependence on distant markets for coal and on company owners who lived in places like Bramwell or in even more distant cities. Sarah had arranged to meet with Margaret Thorne, an 87-year-old woman who had lived in the Bramwell area her entire life and whose grandfather had worked in the red ash mine. During the early 1900s, Margaret lived in a modest single-story house on the outskirts of town, its front porch decorated with potted plants despite the cold weather, its yard carefully maintained with flower beds that would bloom in a few months when spring finally arrived. She greeted Sarah warmly and invited her inside, offering coffee and homemade cookies while they talked. The interior of the house was filled with family photographs spanning generations, faces that told the story of the region's coal mining history through their weathered features, their determined expressions, and their gradual transition from mining work clothes to more varied occupations as the industry declined. Margaret remembered stories her grandfather had told about the mining camps, about the families who had lived and worked there, about the dangers they faced daily, and about the frequent deaths that had marked the community like a recurring wound that never fully healed. She had been particularly interested when Sarah had contacted her about the 1903 photograph because her own grandfather had lost two brothers in mining accidents during that period, making the family history deeply personal and still painful even across more than a century. One brother had died in the same red ash collapse that had killed Thomas Kowalski and his father, crushed under tons of rock when the mine's ceiling had failed. The other had been killed a year later in a gas explosion that had taken 17 lives when a miner's open flame lamp had ignited methane that had accumulated in a poorly ventilated section of the mine. Margaret had grown up hearing about the dangerous conditions, the child labor, the company's frequent disregard for worker safety in favor of production quotas and profit maximization, and the ways families had tried to protect and support each other despite the harsh circumstances. Her grandfather had eventually left mining and had found work as a carpenter, but he had carried the physical and emotional scars of his years underground for the rest of his life. He had suffered from black lung disease, a progressive and incurable condition caused by years of inhaling coal dust, and he had experienced what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress from witnessing multiple mine disasters and deaths of friends and family members. Regarding Miss Elizabeth Hartwell, Margaret had limited direct information, but she remembered her grandfather mentioning a teacher who had been particularly dedicated to the children of the mining camps and who had tried to give them educational opportunities despite the interruptions caused by work demands. Margaret directed Sarah to the cemetery where many of the early residents and mining families had been buried, providing detailed directions to specific sections where the mining families' graves were located. She also gave Sarah the names of several other elderly residents who might have family stories or memories related to the coal camps and the schoolhouse. The cemetery was located on a hillside overlooking the town, accessible by a narrow gravel road that wound up through the trees and opened onto a cleared area where hundreds of headstones marked the final resting places of Bramwell residents dating back to the late 19th century. Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon there, walking among weathered headstones and reading the names and dates carved into granite, marble, and sandstone. The cemetery was divided into sections, with clear distinctions between the elaborate monuments of wealthy families and the modest markers of working-class residents. The mining families section was characterized by simpler stones, some professionally carved but many obviously homemade or crudely finished, and by the heartbreaking number of children's graves marked by small headstones or simple wooden crosses that had weathered but not yet completely disintegrated. She found the graves of several children whose names had appeared on the blackboard. Margaret O'Brien and her brother Patrick were buried in adjacent plots, their small headstones marked only with names, dates, and the word beloved in simple letters. The stones were weathered but still legible, and someone had recently placed small artificial flowers at their bases, suggesting that descendants or historical society members were still tending these graves. Giuseppe Martinelli's grave was in the Catholic section of the cemetery, marked by a headstone bearing both his name in English and an inscription in Italian that Sarah photographed for later translation. She eventually learned it read, Il nostro piccolo ragazzo, preso troppo presto, our little boy, taken too soon. The Kowalski family plot contained markers for Thomas, his father Joseph who had died with him in the mine collapse, and his sister Anna who had died from diphtheria. Thomas's stone included a carving of a lamb, a common Victorian symbol for children who had died young, representing innocence and sacrifice. The family plot also contained a marker for Anna Kowalski, Thomas's mother, who had survived until 1934 before finally being laid to rest beside her husband and two of her children. Sarah wondered what Anna's life had been like in the decades after losing her husband and two children, how she had managed to support her remaining children, and what memories she had carried of those tragic years. Sarah photographed each grave, documenting their locations, the inscriptions on the headstones, and their current conditions. She also discovered a section of the cemetery that contained unmarked graves, small depressions in the ground where headstones had either never been erected due to family poverty or had deteriorated beyond recognition and had not been replaced. These anonymous plots likely contain the remains of other mining camp children whose families had lacked the resources for permanent markers or who had died without identified next of kin during epidemics or disasters when burial had been rushed and record-keeping had broken down. Before leaving the cemetery, Sarah located Miss Elizabeth Hartwell's grave in a section reserved for teachers, ministers, and other educated professionals who had served the community. The headstone was more substantial than those of the children, a polished granite marker approximately 3 feet tall inscribed with her name, her birth date of March 7, 1878, and her death date of October 2, 1946. Below the basic biographical information was an inscription that Sarah found deeply moving. She taught with love and remembered with purpose. The phrase captured something essential about the woman who had created the memorial blackboard, suggesting that her colleagues or family members who had arranged her burial had understood the significance of her commitment to commemorating the dead children of Bramwell. Sarah stood before the grave for a long time, considering the life of this woman who had been only 25 years old when the photograph was taken in 1903, who had already experienced the deaths of 19 students during her first 4 years of teaching, and who had chosen to remain in education in this difficult community rather than seeking easier employment elsewhere. Elizabeth Hartwell had continued teaching in the Bramwell area for several more decades after that photograph, eventually becoming a principal and taking on leadership roles in regional education organizations. She had advocated throughout her career for improved education, for restrictions on child labor, for better safety regulations in mining operations, and for social reforms that would protect vulnerable children from the kinds of deaths that had claimed her students. Sarah returned to Margaret Thorne's house before beginning the drive back to Charleston. The elderly woman had prepared photocopies of documents from her family's collection, including several letters written by her grandfather during the early 1900s that provided first-hand accounts of life in the mining camps. One letter from 1903 specifically mentioned Miss Hartwell, praising her dedication to the children and noting that she had organized a memorial service for all the students who had died during the previous 3 years. The service had been held at the schoolhouse on a Sunday afternoon in late August, just before the beginning of the new school year, with families from multiple coal camps attending to remember their lost children collectively rather than only in individual family grief. The letter described how families had gathered in and around the small schoolhouse, with so many people attending that most had to stand outside and listen through the open windows. Miss Hartwell had read the name of each deceased child, had invited family members to share memories, and had led the group in prayers and hymns. The service had lasted several hours, and many of those present had wept openly as they remembered children who had been taken from them by industrial accidents, diseases, and the harsh conditions of coal camp life. It had been shortly after that memorial service that the school photograph had been taken, which explained the deliberate inclusion of the memorial blackboard in the image. The photograph had been meant to serve as a permanent record of that act of collective remembering, ensuring that the names of the dead children would be preserved beyond the immediate memory of those who had known them. The letter also provided valuable context for the broader community response to child mortality and the ways mining families had developed their own support networks and mourning rituals in the absence of adequate institutional support. When a child died, families from throughout the coal camps would gather to help with the burial, to provide food for the bereaved family, to contribute what little money they could toward funeral expenses, and to share in the grief that was so common that nearly everyone had lost children or siblings or young relatives. These informal support systems had been essential for survival in communities where official assistance was minimal and where the coal companies often showed more concern for production targets than for the welfare of workers and their families. Margaret also showed Sarah a photograph from her family collection showing a group of miners standing outside the entrance to the Red Ash mine around 1905. Among them was her grandfather, a young man in his 20s wearing work clothes and holding a lunch pail, his face already showing the weathering that came from years of underground labor despite his youth. The photograph provided visual context for the world that the children on Miss Hartwell's memorial blackboard had inhabited or would have inhabited if they had lived long enough to follow their fathers and older brothers into the mines. Sarah spent the following 3 months developing her research into a comprehensive article for the Journal of Appalachian Studies, one of the leading academic publications focused on the history, culture, and social conditions of the mountain region. The process required her to balance rigorous academic standards with emotional sensitivity, to present evidence and analysis that would satisfy scholarly peer review while also acknowledging the profound human tragedy that the photograph represented. She worked closely with the West Virginia Historical Society to ensure proper preservation of the original photograph and to arrange for high-quality reproductions that could be used in publications and exhibitions. She also collaborated with descendants of the mining families, some of whom had contacted her after hearing about her research, to verify information and to include their family stories in the expanding historical record. The response to her initial presentation at the annual Appalachian Studies Conference in March was overwhelming and demonstrated the emotional resonance of her discovery beyond purely academic interest. The conference was held at East Tennessee State University, and Sarah's presentation was scheduled in one of the larger meeting rooms, but even that space proved inadequate as more than 200 scholars, students, and community members crowded in to hear about the photograph and the stories of the children whose names appeared on the memorial blackboard. She showed the image on a large screen, walking the audience through each name and telling the brief biographies she had reconstructed from historical records. As she spoke, she noticed many people in the audience wiping away tears, and when she finished her formal presentation, the question and answer session lasted over an hour as people shared their own family stories of child mortality in coal mining communities and expressed gratitude that these deaths were finally receiving serious scholarly attention. Scholars from across the country expressed interest in the photograph and the broader questions it raised about memory, documentation, historical consciousness, and the often invisible victims of industrial expansion. Several historians who studied childhood, labor, immigration, and education contacted Sarah requesting to collaborate on expanded research projects. A documentary filmmaker expressed interest in creating a full-length film about the photograph and the children whose names it preserved. Publishers inquired about the possibility of a book that would tell the stories in greater depth and reach a broader public audience beyond academic journals. Several journalists contacted Sarah requesting interviews, and before long her discovery was being featured in regional and then national media outlets. The New York Times published a feature article with a large reproduction of the photograph. National Public Radio produced a segment for All Things Considered that included readings of the children's names and brief accounts of their deaths. The Washington Post ran an opinion piece arguing that the photograph should be included in American history textbooks as a reminder of the human cost of industrialization. The photograph that had remained obscure in the Historical Society's archives for over a century suddenly became a powerful symbol recognized across the country, representing not just the specific children of Bramwell but all the children who had been sacrificed to coal mining, to textile mills, to factories, to all the industries that had built America's economic power on the bodies of vulnerable workers. What surprised Sarah most was the emotional response from contemporary residents of Appalachian coal country and from descendants of mining families now living across the United States. Hundreds of people reached out through email, social media, and letters to share their own family stories of children lost to mining accidents, disease, and poverty during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Many expressed profound gratitude that these deaths were finally being acknowledged, documented, and treated as historically significant rather than as merely unfortunate but inevitable consequences of industrial progress. For many descendants, the photograph provided a way to understand and process family histories that had been marked by trauma but that had rarely been discussed openly or recorded in official histories. One woman from Ohio wrote describing how her great-grandfather had been killed in a mine collapse in Kentucky in 1907, leaving his wife with 6 children including a baby born after his death. The family had lived in desperate poverty for years, with the older children working in various capacities to contribute to the household. One son had died from typhoid fever at age 10, another had been killed in a mining accident at age 14, and a daughter had died from complications of childbirth at age 16 after being married off to help reduce the family's expenses. The letter writer expressed how meaningful it was to see these kinds of stories finally receiving serious historical attention rather than being dismissed as just the way things were or being romanticized as examples of frontier hardiness and resilience. Sarah organized a memorial event in Bramwell on September 15, 2024, choosing a date that approximated the anniversary of when the original photograph had been taken 121 years earlier. The planning process took several months and involved coordination with the McDowell County Historical Society, local government officials, descendant families, and various organizations dedicated to labor history and historical preservation. The event brought together more than 300 people, including historians, descendants of mining families, local residents, representatives from labor unions and worker safety organizations, and advocates for child welfare and education reform. A permanent historical marker was installed at the site where the schoolhouse had stood, accessible from the road and positioned so visitors could look out over the clearing and imagine the building that had once occupied the space. The marker featured a high-quality reproduction of the 1903 photograph protected behind plexiglass, along with text panels explaining the historical context of child labor in coal mining communities, providing brief biographies of each child whose name appeared on the memorial blackboard, and honoring the memory of all children who had died in industrial accidents during the era of unregulated capitalism and minimal worker protections. The marker had been designed to be both informative and moving, to serve both educational and memorial functions, and to create a physical space where people could come to remember and reflect. The marker's text concluded with a contemporary relevance statement noting that while child labor laws and workplace safety regulations had dramatically improved conditions in the United States, child labor and dangerous working conditions remained serious problems in many parts of the world, and that workplace safety continued to require vigilant enforcement and advocacy even in developed countries. The statement was meant to connect the historical tragedy to ongoing struggles for worker rights and child protection, to make clear that remembering the past was not just about honoring the dead but about informing present-day efforts to prevent similar tragedies. Margaret Thorne, now 88 years old and in declining health, attended the ceremony and spoke movingly about her grandfather's memories of the mining camps and the children who had worked alongside adult miners. Her voice was frail, but her words were clear and powerful as she emphasized that the memorial was not only about remembering the dead but also about acknowledging the resilience of the families who had survived and continued to build communities despite tremendous hardships. She spoke about the importance of telling complete histories that included both the suffering and the resistance, both the exploitation and the solidarity that had developed among working families. Several other elderly residents shared their own family stories during the open microphone portion of the ceremony, creating an oral history record that Sarah documented with audio and video equipment. One man described his grandmother's experience working as a young girl in the breaker room of a mine, sitting for 12 hours a day picking slate from coal until her hands were permanently scarred and her lungs were damaged from coal dust inhalation. Another woman read from letters her great-great-grandmother had written describing the death of a son in a mine accident and the grief that had never fully healed. A third speaker talked about his grandfather's involvement in early union organizing efforts that had sought to improve safety conditions and wages, efforts that had been met with violence from company guards and that had led to his grandfather being blacklisted and forced to leave the region to find work. The ceremony concluded with a reading of each child's name from the memorial blackboard, followed by a moment of silence, and then the placement of 19 white roses at the base of the historical marker, one for each named child. A local children's choir sang hymns that would have been familiar in 1903, and a minister offered prayers for the dead and for all children who had suffered from exploitation and injustice. As the ceremony ended and people began to leave, many lingered at the site, reading the marker's text panels, taking photographs, and talking quietly about what they had learned and how it connected to their own family histories or to their understanding of American history more broadly. In the months following the ceremony, Sarah continued to receive information from people who had researched their own family connections to the children in the photograph or to other coal mining casualties. She maintained a growing database of these stories, recognizing that the 19 names on the blackboard represented only a tiny fraction of the children who had died in similar circumstances throughout the coal regions during the period of rapid industrial expansion. Her research expanded to include comparative analysis of child mortality rates in mining communities across West Virginia, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, and other coal-producing states, revealing patterns of preventable deaths that had continued well into the 20th century until labor laws, safety regulations, and compulsory education requirements were finally established and enforced through sustained political struggle. The photograph itself underwent professional conservation treatment to ensure its preservation for future generations. The original glass plate negative was examined by specialists and was found to be in remarkably good condition despite its age, though it required careful cleaning and was then stored in archival quality housing with controlled temperature and humidity. High-resolution digital scans were created using specialized equipment that captured every detail of the image, and these digital files were backed up in multiple locations to ensure that the image would survive even if something happened to the physical negative. Copies were made available through the West Virginia Historical Society's online archives, allowing researchers, educators, students, and descendants worldwide to access and study the photograph. Museums and educational institutions across the country requested permission to include the photograph in exhibitions about labor history, childhood studies, immigration, education history, and Appalachian culture. The Smithsonian's National Museum of American History included it in a major exhibition about child labor in America, presenting it alongside photographs of children working in textile mills, glass factories, and agricultural fields. Each use of the image was required to include the names of the 19 children and basic information about their lives and deaths, fulfilling Miss Elizabeth Hartwell's apparent intention to ensure that these children would be remembered as individuals rather than as anonymous statistics. Sarah's expanding research revealed additional information about Elizabeth Hartwell's later life and career that helped complete her understanding of the woman who had created the memorial blackboard. After teaching in Bramwell for 15 years, Elizabeth had moved to Charleston in 1914 and had become involved in progressive education reform movements and child welfare advocacy at the state level. She had written numerous articles for regional newspapers and education journals arguing for compulsory education laws that would require children to attend school rather than work, for restrictions on child labor that would protect young people from dangerous industrial work, and for improved safety standards in mining operations that would reduce the appalling death toll among workers. Her advocacy work had been part of a broader progressive movement that had emerged in the early 20th century in response to the worst excesses of industrial capitalism. This movement had included journalists who exposed dangerous working conditions and child labor abuses, social workers who documented the lives of the poor and advocated for reform, labor organizers who fought for better wages and conditions, and politicians who eventually passed legislation regulating industry and protecting workers. Elizabeth Hartwell's contributions had been significant, though not as publicly prominent as some other reformers, and Sarah's research was helping to restore her to historical memory as someone who had been motivated by direct experience of tragedy to become an advocate for change. Letters from Elizabeth Hartwell's later years, discovered in a personal collection donated to the West Virginia State Archives by a distant relative, revealed her continued grief over the students she had lost and her sense of responsibility to honor their memory through her advocacy work. In a particularly poignant letter written in 1935 to a former teaching colleague, Elizabeth described the 1903 photograph as one of her most treasured possessions, explaining that she had specifically requested the photographer include the memorial blackboard in the image to create a permanent record of the children's names. She wrote that even after more than 30 years, she could still remember each child's face, voice, and personality, could still recall their individual characteristics and potential, and could still feel the pain of their losses as if the deaths had happened recently rather than decades in the past. The letter continued with Elizabeth reflecting on how society had changed during her lifetime, how child labor laws had been enacted and were being enforced with varying degrees of success, how compulsory education had become standard in most states, how workplace safety regulations had reduced though not eliminated mining deaths, and how the labor movement had won significant improvements in wages and working conditions. But she also noted that these changes had come too late for the children whose names appeared on her blackboard, and that the debt owed to those who had suffered and died during the worst years of exploitation could never be fully repaid. The best that later generations could do was to honor their memory through continued commitment to protecting vulnerable people, to maintaining and strengthening the reforms that had been won, and to remembering that progress was not inevitable but required constant vigilance and advocacy. The impact of Sarah's research and the publicity surrounding the photograph extended far beyond academic circles and memorial ceremonies. Local schools throughout McDowell County and across southern West Virginia began incorporating the photograph and the stories of the 19 children into their curriculum, using them to teach students about their region's history, about the development of labor rights and workplace safety protections, and about the importance of education and child welfare. Teachers reported that students found the stories powerful and relevant, that learning about children their own ages who had worked in mines and died in industrial accidents made history feel immediate and personal rather than distant and abstract. The West Virginia State Legislature passed a joint resolution in 2025 formally honoring the memory of all child workers who had died in mining operations and other industrial work throughout the state's history. The resolution committed the state to preserving coal mining history in all its complexity, including both the economic development that mining had enabled and the human costs that had been paid by workers and their families. The resolution also established an annual Child Worker Memorial Day to be observed in schools and communities across the state, ensuring that future generations would continue to learn about this chapter of history. Labor unions used the photograph extensively in educational materials about the history of worker protection and the ongoing importance of safety regulations, workplace inspections, and collective bargaining. The United Mine Workers of America, which had fought for generations to improve conditions in coal mines and had lost many members in mining disasters, adopted the image as a symbol of why their work remained essential. Union educators used the photograph in training sessions with new members, connecting the historical tragedy to contemporary struggles over mine safety regulations, black lung disease compensation, and economic justice for mining communities. Several documentary films were produced exploring the photograph and its context. One filmmaker spent 2 years researching and interviewing descendants of the children whose names appeared on the blackboard, creating an emotional and historically rigorous film that premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and was subsequently broadcast on PBS. The film included dramatic readings of the children's names, reenactments of their deaths based on historical records, and contemporary footage of the former mining sites and the communities that had survived the industry's collapse. The film's final image was the 1903 photograph, held on screen for a full minute in silence as the credits rolled, ensuring that viewers could contemplate the faces of the surviving children and the names written on the blackboard behind them. Sarah reflected frequently on how a single photograph taken over a century ago in a small Appalachian schoolhouse had revealed so much about an entire era, about an entire community, and about fundamental questions of memory, justice, and historical consciousness. The image had preserved not only the faces of surviving students and their dedicated teacher but also, through the careful inscription on the blackboard, the names of children who might otherwise have remained anonymous casualties of industrial expansion, forgotten by everyone except their immediate families and then eventually forgotten even by them as generations passed and memories faded. Miss Elizabeth Hartwell's decision to include that memorial board in the photograph had been an act of documentation and resistance, a refusal to accept the erasure of these children from history, an insistence that future generations would know that Thomas Kowalski, Margaret O'Brien, James Dawson, Giuseppe Martinelli, and 15 others had existed, had been loved and valued by their teacher and community, and had died in circumstances that should never have been accepted as normal or inevitable. In an era when working-class children and especially the children of immigrants were often treated as disposable labor whose deaths warranted little official attention or mourning, Elizabeth Hartwell had ensured that at least these 19 children would be remembered permanently. The photograph continued to generate new research, discussion, and emotional responses as it circulated more widely through academic networks, museum exhibitions, media coverage, and social media. Scholars examined it for insights into everything from classroom architecture and teaching methods to clothing styles, photographic techniques, ethnic diversity in coal mining communities, and the visual representation of memory and mourning. But the most enduring significance remained the memorial blackboard itself, that carefully written list of names that transformed an ordinary school photograph into a powerful historical document that continued to move people more than a century after it had been taken. Each name on that blackboard represented a life cut short by industrial capitalism's demands for cheap labor and maximum production regardless of human cost. Each name represented a family devastated by loss, parents who had buried children they had brought into the world and tried to protect. Each name represented a community wounded repeatedly by tragedies that were preventable but that continued to occur because profit was prioritized over safety, because companies resisted reforms that would reduce their earnings, because workers lacked the power to demand better conditions. Together, these names bore witness to a chapter of American history that had often been glossed over or forgotten in celebratory narratives of industrial progress, economic growth, and national development. Sarah Mitchell's work ensured that Thomas Kowalski, Margaret O'Brien, James Dawson, Giuseppe Martinelli, Anna Kowalczyk, Patrick Sullivan, John Novak, and the 12 other children whose names appeared on that blackboard would be remembered not as statistics in historical databases but as individuals who had lived, had learned, had played, had dreamed, and had mattered to the people who knew them. Their teacher had given them a memorial in chalk captured in a photograph. Sarah had given them a memorial in scholarship, in publications, in museum exhibitions, in memorial ceremonies, and in public history that would reach audiences Elizabeth Hartwell could never have imagined. And through these combined efforts, separated by more than a century but united in purpose, the children of Bramwell would continue to teach future generations about the true cost of the lives we build, about the debts we owe to those who paid the price for prosperity, and about the responsibility we have to remember, to honor, and to ensure that such tragedies never happen again. The photograph had become more than a historical document. It had become a call to conscience, a reminder that progress must be measured not just in terms of economic output or technological advancement but in terms of human dignity, of justice, of the protection of the vulnerable, and of the kind of society we are building and for whom. Every person who looked at that photograph and read those names on the blackboard was confronted with fundamental questions about values, about priorities, about what we are willing to sacrifice in pursuit of wealth and power, and about what kind of world we want to create and leave to future generations. In that sense, the 19 children of Bramwell continued to teach, continued to challenge, and continued to remind us of the human dimension of history and of the moral obligations we carry as inheritors of both the benefits and the costs of what came before.